and it's becoming an uncontrolled menace, not only in our country, but across the world. Now, these are foods which have undergone intense industrial, physical, chemical, or genetic modification by addition of artificial additives. They have high total fats, saturated fats, trans fats, and sugar. These are usually highly palatable. They have increased shelf life, and they are usually addictive. If you look at the food colors, red 40 and yellow 6, these are the food colors which are used very, very frequently in Indian and Western context. They are shown to induce colitis in the presence of a specific microbiome. The European Union has now banned titanium dioxide because it's mutagenic. Unfortunately, in India, we still have food products which contain titanium dioxide. Now, the packaging is usually in plastic, and that is the reason why we today have in fishes and in our food chain, we now have micro particles, nanoparticles, and microplastics, which I'll be taking up in a subsequent talk. The menace of microplastics is also something which we have to learn to cut down or completely eliminate the use of plastic, because these contact packaging contaminants are very rich in phthalates, bisphenols, and microplastics, and both these things are definitely carcinogenic. Each 10% increase in UPF intake leads to almost a 20% increase in the risk of CD. Good evening, Barsha, and thanks once again for that kind introduction. And this is a topic I've been meaning to talk about for quite some time, and we finally got around to doing it because this is something which concerns each one of us as practitioners, and it's becoming an uncontrolled menace, not only in our country, but across the world. So in the next 40 minutes, I'll take you through a deep dive of the menace which ultra-processed food has created today, and also with a focus on the GI dysfunctions, which are increasing and almost assuming epidemic proportions because of this particular condition. As part of this, I would also like to tell you that I would be in the future talking about microplastics and also the obesity epidemic which has occurred because of these things. So this will be almost a 3-part series, with the first part being today, and that is with the ultra processed food menace. So let's get started. So what exactly is the ultra processed food addiction, and is it an epidemic? Now, this was an editorial which appeared in 2022 in Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics. And if you see, there are two photographs here. On the left side, you have the traditional sort of food which we all consume at home. And then there is the fast food on the right side with a lot of junk food. No prizes for guessing what is more unhealthy and why it is so, we'll see. So if you look at the ultra processed contribution to daily calorie intake across the world, if you look, the USA, as it dominates in many other things, here also the USA leads by the contribution of ultra processed foods to its daily energy intake. And this is based on dietary intake through nationally representative surveys. Unfortunately, in India, we do not have such surveys, but they are now being instituted by certain bodies, and hopefully by next year we should have some guidelines about the daily energy intakes based on ultra processed food intakes. But as you can see, it's quite high, the ultra processed food contribution to daily calorie intake. Now, if you look at India, these are certain studies through retail sales of total processed food versus ultra processed food versus essential foods from 2011 to 2021. And if you look at the value of the ultra processed food vis-a-vis the total processed food, it is definitely going up year on year. And as you can see, pre-COVID and post-COVID also, it has gone up. So suffice to say that we are also no different from the US when it comes to the consumption of UPF food. Now, what exactly is ultra processed food? So when we talk about food, we need to understand that there are categories of food, and this is classified by what is known as the NOVA classification, where you have different groups. So in the NOVA classification, the first group you have unprocessed or minimally processed foods. These are fresh, dry, or frozen vegetables or fruit, grains, legumes, meat, fish, eggs, nuts, and seeds. Processing, what exactly do we mean by processed food? It includes removal of inedible or unwanted parts. So suppose you want to have a fruit, let's say apple, and if you take off the uh, outer covering of the apple and you peel off the skin, this is a sort of a processing. Okay. Now, similarly, a lot of things lose their nutrients when they are smoked and preserved or put into cold storage. So this is the meaning of processed food. Then you have NOVA Group 2, which is the processed culinary ingredients. What are these? These can be plant oils, which could be olive oil or coconut oil or sesame or whatever. Then you have animal fats, which are basically cream, butter, lard and all, which are byproducts of milk, which when gets treated and processed gives you cream and butter, etc. You could have maple syrup, sugar, honey and salt, which comes from basic processing of cane, sugar cane, and also these are substances which are derived from group 1 foods or from nature by processes including pressing, refining, grinding, milling and drying. So all these things lead to what are known as processed culinary ingredients. Group 3 is the processed foods. These are the canned or the pickled vegetables, meat which is smoked or cold storage, fish, fruit, artisanal bread, cheese, salted meats, wine, beer, and cider, etc. Processing of foods from group 1 or 2 with the addition of oil, salt, or sugar by means of canning, pickling, smoking, curing, or fermentation is basically what gives you processed foods. I hope you are with me till now. Let me go back a little and again refresh your memory on this. Group 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed food. Then you have processed culinary ingredients where you could do pressing, refining, grinding, milling, and drying. Then comes the third stage, which is the processed food, where you are basically adding oil, salt, or sugar to group 1 or 2, NOVA group 1 and 2 food products by means of canning, pickling, smoking, curing, or fermentation. And finally, you come to group 4, which is the ultra processed food, which is the one which has the most menacing profile in terms of disease causation. Now, these are foods which have undergone intense industrial, physical, chemical, or genetic modification by addition of artificial additives. They have high total fats, saturated fats, trans fats, and sugar. These are usually highly palatable. They have increased shelf life and they are usually addictive. So these are the group 4 ultra processed foods. I'm sure you can recognize a lot of these. A lot of us are consuming these on a regular basis. And if we are not consuming, at least we are seeing a lot of patients who do this. So these are the ultra processed foods, which are sugary, sweetened beverages, sweet and savory packaged snacks, reconstituted meat products, pre-prepared frozen dishes, canned and instant soups, chicken nuggets, ice cream, and so-called gelatos and desserts. Formulations made from a series of processes which include extraction and chemical modification, and these include very little of the intact group 1 foods. If you remember, group 1 is the most healthy and the most unprocessed food which we could eat. Unfortunately, we are all eating a lot of powdered and packaged soups, noodles, desserts. In an Indian context, as you can see, there are the namkeens and the sweets, confectionery, biscuits, pastries, cakes, margarine and spreads, sweetened breakfast cereals, and packaged bread. Now, all these things constitute what is known as the ultra processed food, or UPF for short. So food additives basically are an integral part of UPF. For anything to be ultra processed, it is either emulsified or artificially sweetened, or colors get added to it, or microparticles are introduced into that particular food. Let us quickly look at the group 4 ultra processed food products again. Like I said, it can include confectionery, biscuits, pastries, cakes, margarine and spreads. It can include sweetened breakfast cereals like Kellogg's, etc. ready to eat meals, meat which is smoked or in cold storage or ready to eat by heating, poultry products, fish nuggets, sausages, burgers and hot dogs, powdered and packaged soups, noodles and desserts. And in the Indian context, we shouldn't forget the namkeens and the sweets, which your local halwai or the kirana store also stocks very well. Now, if you look at the food colors, why do we talk about food colors being bad? If you look at the food colors, red 40 and yellow 6, these are the food colors which are used very, very frequently in Indian and Western context. They are shown to induce colitis in the presence of a specific microbiome through their metabolites like 1-ENSA. And if you look at the slide, it shows how it causes an inflammatory change by being metabolized by the commensal bacteria, which then leading to interleukin 23, leading to CD4 cascade, and then interferon gamma cascade, which leads to inflammation of the gut. Then you have the emulsifiers. These are found in about 60% of the ultra processed food. Why are they used? Because they stabilize the consistency, they lengthen shelf life, and they feel very good in your mouth. They are extremely addictive. So the emulsifiers which are used are lecithin in chocolate, fatty acid glycerides in ice cream, guar gum in dairy products, carrageenan for iced coffee, milk, and frozen desserts, celluloses for dietary supplements, polysorbates, which are found in edible oil. They are found in the cake mix, and they are also used for icing purposes. And we now know that emulsifiers are very strongly linked to increased incidence of IBD, like ulcerative colitis, and more importantly, for Crohn's disease. Now, I also talked about micro and nanoparticles. These are used as food additives to influence color, consistency, or appearance. Dear friends, please keep in mind that any ultra processed food has to look good, has to stay fresh in packaged form for longer periods of time, and should have consistency and very good palatability and taste in the mouth. So to do all this, they add colors, they add emulsifiers, and they also add micro and nanoparticles. These influence the color, consistency, and appearance. These are inorganic particles which are usually 0.1 to 1 millimeter in size. Nanoparticles are those which are less than 100 millimeter. And these are titanium dioxide, aluminum silicate, and silicon dioxide. The European Union has now banned titanium dioxide because it's mutagenic. Unfortunately, in India, we still have food products which contain titanium dioxide. So please read the product ingredients very carefully whenever you consume any sort of packaged food. Microparticles, like I said, are basically causing pro-inflammatory cytokine cascade. They induce colitis. They lead to reactive oxidative stress. They alter gene transcription, and these lead to dysplasia and colorectal cancer. So this is a wonderful review which came out in Nature by Whelan et al. In 2024, not too far back, which said that there was decreased bacterial diversity and decreased fecal bacterium prosnitzi species, which is basically protective against the mutagenic effects of titanium dioxide. Titanium dioxide leads to an inflammatory response through interleukin cascade, which leads to reactive oxidative stress and also causes inflammation in the GI tract, which basically leads to IBD and colitis and so on and so forth. And finally, the worst thing is that it can lead to CRC or dysplasia. So what are the contaminants from processing or packaging? See, there are multiple stages where food gets processed. The first is at the stage of the production, where to add value to the value chain in terms of causing increased shelf life and all, preservatives and all are used. Then you have the processing, which can be potentially toxic due to the addition of furans, heterocyclic amines, acrolein, and acrylamide from high temperature cooking of foods, starches, and French fries and all. Then you have the packaging. Now the packaging is usually in plastic, and that is the reason why we today have in fishes and in our food chain, we now have micro particles, nanoparticles, and microplastics, which I'll be taking up in a subsequent talk. The menace of microplastics is also something which we have to learn to cut down or completely eliminate the use of plastic, because these contact packaging contaminants are very rich in phthalates, bisphenols, and microplastics, and both these things are definitely carcinogenic. So the processing of the food as well as the packaging in which it is given to the consumers are both potentially carcinogenic. Now, if you look at this slide, this is a busy slide which says that because there is increased amounts of salt, sugar, saturated fats, and energy, and decreased amounts of fiber, vitamins, and micronutrients, actually what we are consuming has lower nutritional quality. However, because ultra processed food consumption is increasing and there are changes in the food metrics and texture, so we now are exposed to the contaminants from processing as well as food additives and other industrial ingredients, and also the contact materials which are used for packaging. So all these lead to increased risk of chronic diseases, weight gain, and finally increased mortality. So what is the magnitude of the problem? If you look at this study which appeared in BMJ, it showed that ultra processed food exposure was directly linked to adverse health outcomes. The summary was that higher dietary exposure to UPF foods was associated with a higher risk of adverse health outcomes in 32 out of 45 pooled meta-analysis, which says that 71% higher chance was seen in these studies. And these were 14 meta-analysis studies and 45 pooled analysis, and UPF was defined by the NOVA classification. And if you look at the population which was studied, it's a huge number, and the number was exceeding a few million, and the participants included were irrespective of health status and age. These were the outcomes. You can look at the actual paper. I have also given the link below. It appeared in BMJ, which is one of the high impact journals, peer-reviewed journals. The evidence quality was quite convincing that there is a moderately increased risk of type 2 diabetes. There is a suggestion that all causes of mortality are definitely increased, highly suggestive that obesity and all-cause mortality along with depression and wheezing and type 2 diabetes are increased. There's a definite suggestion that coronary vascular disease events along with neurological events with abdominal obesity, overweight, colorectal cancer and hypertension also increase with ultra-processed food. Now, since I'm a gastroenterologist and we keep talking about gut health, there is a direct correlation between bad gut health and ultra-processed food. Ultra-processed food promotes the causation of NAFLD or MASLD as it is called. It causes increased colorectal cancer. It leads to higher incidence of inflammatory bowel disease and IBS, and all retrospective data from cohorts who have recorded food intake along with NOVA classification bear this out. So now, as we know, ultra-processed foods cause excessive calorie intake and weight gain. If you look at ultra-processed diet, if the diets are presented in random order and matched for provided calories, sugar, fat, fiber, and macronutrients. So if you look at the ultra-processed, which is the blue line, and the unprocessed, which is the red line. The unprocessed diet is on your right, the ultra-processed food is on the left. So the ultra-processed diet, what we see is the intake increases because it's highly addictive and one tends to overeat whenever we are looking at ultra-processed diet. So the body weight with ultra-processed diet intake keeps increasing. And as you can see, the worms have diverged completely at the bottom of the slide, where if you look at the days on diet with unprocessed food, actually the weight tends to fall over a period of 14 days when you use unprocessed food, whereas the weight tends to increase and stay elevated at the end of 14 days with ultra-processed food. Same is the situation if you look at the calorie intake. Now, this is again a seminal study which appeared in one of the basic sciences journal known as Cellular Metabolism in 2019. So this is how it works. Ultra-processed food leads to a direct increase in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, which is MASLD. The fats which are there in ultra-processed food, they increase the intrahepatic triglycerides. The refined cholates increase the lipogenesis and saturated fatty acids. The salt which is present in UPF causes decreased leptin sensitivity and increase in fructose levels, All this leads to fatty liver. And finally, the role of food packaging due to the plastics used and the use of furans and bisphenols and phthalates and all also lead to hepatic adiposity. So the net result of consumption of UPF is that your liver becomes fatty, you tend to gain weight, and all causes mortality because of cardiovascular disease, CNS dysfunction and all increases. So this is another study which appeared in 2024. This is from China, from Zhao's group, appeared in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, where they said that they found UPF intake to be associated with NAFLD cirrhosis and severe liver disease. And if you look at the figures, these are quite scary figures. These have appeared from UK as well as from China. This was a multi-country study and is now quoted quite widely. Ultra-processed food consumption and GI cancer risk has also been studied quite extensively across the world. And this is something which appeared in the American Journal of Gastroenterology. This is again a very high impact journal, which showed that ultra-processed food and risk of GI cancer was directly correlated. And the classification of NOVA 4 food types, which is the UPF, with the highest versus the lowest UPF consumption, showed that the risk of colorectal cancer, colon cancer, and non-cardiac gastric cancer is much higher in patients who take UPF on a regular basis. So this is the particular study. If you look at the chart, this is a very busy slide. Suffice to say that the incidence of colorectal cancer, colon cancer, and non-cardiac gastric cancer is much higher in patients who are on ultra-processed food intake. So if you look at the UPF and CRC, the prospective cohort studies of health professionals, this is about medicos, which was done 46,341. There was a 29% increased risk of CRC. This was limited to the distal CA, more in males, and higher for meat or ready-to-eat consumers who also were taking sugary beverages. So these were all prospective cohort studies in which you had a lot of health professionals, including doctors and nurses, and this was found that nearly 30% increased risk of CRC was found with UPF. What is the risk of UPF and adenomas? It found in a big study where again you had more than almost 1.5 lakh patients that the adenoma risk is much higher, along with serrated adenomatous risk with UPF intake. So how does reducing the food processing impact our outcomes? So this is the data from the prospective EPIC data, where more than 4.5 lakh individuals were found to were asked to substitute processed food with minimally processed food, and it was found that the overall cancer risk, the odds ratio, definitely changed in their favor when they went from fully ultra processed food to minimally processed food. So food processing has been found to be an increased independent risk factor along with the packaging of the food in the causation of colorectal cancer. What about the risk of inflammatory bowel disease, that is ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease? Again, there is an increased risk of developing Crohn's disease, and there is no increased risk of developing UC in this particular study, which was published quite recently in 2024 only. It had a large number of participants, more than 10 lakh, and there was a good amount of follow-up where they found that exposure to NOVA class 4, which was high consumption versus lower consumption, led to a definite increase in CD, not so much in ulcerative colitis, but it was definitely a red flag when it came to Crohn's disease. So if you look at the IBD meta-analysis, each 10% increase in UPF intake leads to almost a 20% increase in the risk of CD, and there is a positive linear relationship between ultra-processed food intake and the causation of Crohn's disease. Now, if you look at the ultra-processed food consumption and long-term risk of IBS, we just talked about IBD. IBS is something which we term as a functional GI disease. Here again, this is a big study with almost 1.78 lakh participants. Ultra-processed food was seen in these patients. The follow-up was for as long as 11.3 years. And it was found that every 10% increment of UPF was associated with an increased incidence of IBS by about 10%. So compared to the lowest quartile, the highest quartile of UPF consumption had an increased risk of incident IBS. So there is no doubt in any scientist's mind now that when you have high usage of ultra processed food over a sustained period of time, you are definitely more susceptible to the causation of NAFLD, obesity, cardiovascular disease. When it comes to an altered microbiota and gut microbiome dysbiosis leading to IBS, IBD, dysplasia, and colorectal cancer. So UPF and IBS, there is a higher pro-inflammatory diet, there is a higher IBS, no debate on that. And we all know that higher content of FODMAPs increases colonic water and gas and increased short-chain fatty acids, all leading to bloating and diarrhea. Higher use of emulsifiers, thickeners, additives, they alter the composition and function of microbiota, they increase the mucosal inflammation and increase the permeability of the GI mucosa, leading to increased causation of inflammatory bowel disease, IBS, CRC, and finally cancers. So we are now very well aware of the obesogenic properties of ultra processed food. Now what happens if you add alcohol to it? Now alcohol brings another set of problems to this table with ultra processed food, because again alcohol is rich with additives which can be potentially mutagenic in the form of titanium dioxide and sodium nitrate. There can be newer contaminants like trans fats and heterocyclic amines. Alcohol could also have sweeteners and emulsifiers like microbiota, leading to chronic inflammatory changes, and chemical contaminants from the packaging of ultra processed food along with alcohol can be potentially carcinogenic. So if you look at the microbiome, what happens exactly to the microbiome? What happens is that the ultra processed food increases the virulence of the microbiota. It increases the inflammatory potential of the commensal bacteria, causes chronic inflammation by altering the metabolites, and it predisposes to experimental colitis as it was found in rats and in monkeys. The same thing has been confirmed by this Lancet study in human beings, where one could see that there was an increase in the inflammatory cascade. So these are the microbiome alterations due to the food additives. You have a normal host microbiota interaction where you have normal gut microbiome. This gets upset by emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, food colors, and nanoparticles. This leads to increased permeability due to a paucity of the good bacteria and a predominance of the virulent bacteria, leading to increased inflammation in terms of the interleukin cascade. Finally, it leads to increased permeability, causes dysplasia, can lead to CRC, and definitely lead to IBS and increased incidence of IBD. So when you have microbiota changed, there is a diversity which is lost, and it's a pro-inflammatory state. So what exactly do we mean by diversity? Our gut microbiota is a living organ. It weighs almost 750 grams. There are billions and trillions of bacteria of the good type and the bad type which coexist in harmony. And this is what constitutes what is known as the second brain. The moment you take this ultra processed food, the microbiota starts changing, and within a period of 15 to 30 days, the microbiota can be changed for the worse by losing the good bacteria, having a predominance of the pathological bacteria, and having a pro-inflammatory state of the GI tract. So the diet-induced microbiota change is inherited by this particular use of UPF. Dysbiosis can be induced in the diet of the mother and can be transferred to offsprings by inducing inheritable metabolic changes. So you can have in the mices, this has already been checked in the mices. You still have no human studies where this has been tried out. So what was found was that if you could induce dysbiosis in mice, then over a period of 2 to 3 generations, this particular change can be inherited by the future progeny. And it stands to reason that if we have microplastics and nanoparticles in our food chain, and they lead to changes in our gut microbiota, and now with more and more genetic food being engineered, and we taking and consuming that food unknowingly or knowingly, we might end up with permanent gene transcription changes, which would then be inheritable in our progeny and would lead to increased incidence of IBD, IBS, NAFLD, and colorectal cancer. So A word about carboxymethyl cellulose. This is a very potent alteration agent for the microbiome. It's an emulsifier. It reduces the short chain fatty acids and the free amino acids, leads to alteration in the gut microbiota, leads to less diversity and inflammatory changes. And like I said, it leads to a definite increase in the depletion of the fecal metabolome and leads to a disease status. Artificial sweeteners are again something which are a huge problem. Most of us consume these unwittingly in things like biscuits, pastries, cakes and all. These again have been shown in human studies to deplete the diversity, and in animal studies they have shown bacterial translocation leading to microbiota diversity alteration and increased intestinal permeability and histological damage. Emulsifiers I've already spoken about. They again work by the same principle. They induce perturbed host microbiota interaction, increase the permeability of the intestine, alter the microbiota, increase the inflammation, and reduce the mucin 2 expression, which is basically protective in nature. So now let's talk a little bit about UPF in Indian foods. There was a question on the platform where somebody had asked me about Eastern and Western diet. Now see, the problem with Eastern and Western diet has probably got blurred because today in India, we also end up consuming a lot of ultra-processed food. So this particular study from Uday Ghoshaal's group was published in BMC Public Health. And this was the first study from India which studied 375 items. Now, when we talk about samosa, jalebi, sweets, matri, namkeen and all, we all think there can be nothing wrong in it. Our grandparents were also eating these. What we tend to forget is our grandparents didn't deal with the adulterated food we consume. They didn't have the bad water supply we had. They didn't have to deal with the atmospheric pollution which we deal with. And the overall packaging and all of these things in plastics and all was something our grandparents never had to deal with. So when we talk about namkeens, all your haldirams and your basic navratans and whatnot contain a lot of maltodextrin, dextrose, flavor enhancers, anti-caking agents and synthetic colors. Then let's come to frozen foods. Frozen foods are actually swimming in emulsifiers, antioxidants. They're rich in sodium nitrate and preservatives, colors. They also have an anti-caking agent and a raising agent, which is basically a sort of yeast along with maltodextrin. We might think that papads are quite healthy. They are not, because they have a lot of raising agents. They are also very rich in salt, sodium bicarbonate and preservatives. So if you look at the UPF in Indian foods, it's not less. So if you look at this study had a fairly decent amount of credibility, and it showed these sort of problems which can arise with UPF food. So it showed that there was an increased mortality, there was an increased risk in cancers, there was an increase in mental health issues in terms of insomnia, anxiety, depression. Respiratory health also went for a toss along with COPD, asthma and wheezing. Cardiovascular health, no prizes for guessing that that's actually heart attack food which we are consuming, because it increases the hypertension, it increases the triglycerides, and it increases the LDL. Gastrointestinal health I have already spoken about, gets definitely upset through IBD, IBS and all. And metabolic health is something which is now coming in increasing focus because of the abdominal obesity due to ultra-processed food, hyperglycemia, metabolic syndrome, NAFLD, obesity, and all the problems of being overweight. So to summarize, we now have epidemiological evidence of disease risk increase. Ultra-processed food intake has been linked to IBD, colorectal cancer, irritable bowel syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. How does ultra-processed food intake affect our GI health? It affects the microbiota. It increases intestinal inflammation. That leads to increased permeability. It leads to reactive oxidative stress. Many of these additives have carcinogenic potential. Many times it is difficult to nail down the culprit. Is it the nutrient profile? Is it the food additive? Is it the packaging? Is it the microplastics? The jury is still out on that, but what is not in doubt is that ultra-processed food is bad news, and it is something which is going to hit us as a developing nation as we get more and more westernized and we start taking more and more smoked, cured, pickled, canned, ready-to-eat food, which is definitely ultra-processed. We will definitely be facing this epidemic if we are not already in it. So what next? So that we will need a lot of studies which will need to sort of strike a balance between low versus high ultra processed food. What should be the sufficient number, and follow up? How much ultra processed food is too much? Is there a cutoff? We still don't know. And is the effect of high UPF intake reversible, or is it an irreversible change which we are doomed once that happens? So the only way forward to stop this epidemic, in my mind, is to be very, very vigilant about what we eat. Like I say, these things come for free. You buy one, you get 5 free. Buy a big belly. If you have a big belly due to consumption of adipogenetic food, which is the ultra processed food, you get high blood pressure, you get diabetes, you get coronary artery disease, you get a bad liver, you get a bad knees. So basically, it is buy one, get 5 free, and all these 5 are enough to give you a bad quality of life and definitely curtail the quantity of life. Thank you very much, and it will be my pleasure to take any questions from the audience. Over to you, Barsha.
For yet another wonderful. We do have some doubts coming in from our doctors. So starting off with the earlier questions that they had. So Dr. Patel wants to know, how about Mediterranean food in diet?
Yeah, Dr. Patel, that's a very good question. I didn't address Mediterranean food because basically Mediterranean food, the classical, what is known as the blue water diet, which is the Mediterranean diet, is very rich in salads, fruits, and raw food. Even the fish in many of these Mediterranean diets is basically fresh catch, which is then just grilled or smoked. So Mediterranean food is actually considered one of the healthiest diets one can have, but it comes with a caveat. In India, unfortunately, most of the food we take is very rich in spices, in cholesterol, in the oils, and we sort of drown the food taste in the spices and all. If you go to Italy, and where the Mediterranean food is basically easily available, what you hear there is that why do Indians come here and they want so much of chili and pepper and whatnot? You should be able to taste the food for the taste of the food and not be overpowered by the additives. So I agree with you. Mediterranean food is healthy, but it may be too expensive in an Indian context because the oil used is extra virgin olive oil for Mediterranean food, which may not be a very logical or an economical solution for most of our population. However, for those who can do it, it's a very, very healthy diet and is known to cause people to have a long, healthy lifespan.
So next from Dr. Benjamin, what about instant oats and atta or flour? Is it affecting our health?
Yeah, great question, Dr. Benjamin, and thanks for that question. Yes, definitely it has a deleterious effect because please keep in mind anything instant, whatever food product it is basically rich in food additives. It will be usually ultra processed so that it has a high shelf life. None of the makers of any of these food products wants anything to be wasted, so they would like it to be on the shelf without spoiling. So obviously all these things have a deleterious effect. The best thing is, when you talk about flour, is to have the home ground flour if one can do it. If not, it is best to get your own flour in front of you when it is ground, and it is definitely a much healthier option.
So next, Dr. Kulkarni is asking, also UPF, will it cause relative deficiency of essential nutrition leading to malmetabolism?
Yes, Dr. Kulkarni, definitely. Basically, UPF is known to cause what is known as malnutrition. Now, we technically always tend to assume that malnutrition means that the patient should be like a skeleton, but overweight patients also are suffering from malnutrition. So basically, UPF leads to the problem of obesity. It leads to a problem of plenty in terms of fat, triglycerides, cholesterol, and it leads to a problem of paucity in terms of vitamin levels, essential micronutrients, and therefore it leads to malmetabolism, like you very rightly pointed out.
So next, Dr. Ravindra wants to know if you could kindly enlighten on how processed food loses its nutrition value.
Yeah, great question again, Dr. Kulkarni. See, basically, processed food undergoes certain changes to the actual constitution of food as it was supposed to be. So, if you have something which has added salt, emulsifier, nanoparticles, uh, lecithin, you have bisphenols, acrylamine, and all, it will improve the texture of the food. It will be much smoother. Let me give you a small example. If you take raw isabgol and you put it into a glass of water, it will tend to form lumps at the bottom, and it's not as palatable as the isabgol, which is ultra refined. You know, so most of our patients come back and complain to us that, sir, we can't take this because it's not very palatable. I don't like the taste. I don't like how it looks. It becomes very lumpy and all. But if you give them processed isabgol, which is less rich in the fiber, which is exactly why you are giving them the isabgol in the first place, then the patients are happy to consume that because this is far smoother on the tongue, it's easier to swallow, and they feel much better. It's the same with food. Now, this sort of food is either flash fried, it is subjected to very high temperatures to desiccate it and to dry it out so that it doesn't spoil. The moment you do that with flash frying and all these things, you have lost all nutritive value because you pretty much denatured whatever uh, protein and all existed in that food. Now, what you are basically consuming is almost like RO water. RO water is what I term as depleted of all minerals. So it is basically water which quenches your thirst but doesn't do anything more for us. So this is exactly how ultra processed food loses its nutritive value whenever you do any canning, pickling, salting, smoking, or put it through any cold storage process.
Next, Dr. Nikhil is asking why is sugar not good in food?
Dr. Nikhil, I don't say that sugar is not good in food. It is the amount of sugar you take and the sort of sugar you are taking. If you're taking unprocessed sugar, a small amount of sugar is fine. If you're not a diabetic and if you're not suffering from hyperglycemia and all, some amount of sugar is definitely available to you in a visible or an invisible form in whatever food you're taking. The problem is we have now reached the stage where artificial sweeteners have started ruling the roost, and these are known to be carcinogenic. I get very educated youngsters these days who tell me that they take only diet coke, or they will say that we take zero coke, whatever it means. Now, if you look at the amount of the additives which are present in these drinks, it is actually much worse than taking coke of the normal type. You understand what I'm trying to say? So it is not that sugar is not good. It is the sort of sugar which you are taking, which will increase your fructose levels, which will increase your triglycerides, and the way you consume it along with your exercise levels and the other things. Like I said, whether you already suffer from a metabolic syndrome, whether you are pre-diabetic or an existing diabetic, will determine whether sugar is good for you. But some amount of sugar is almost inevitable and you can't get away from it.
There was another question from Dr. Patel. How is the repeated use of cooking oil a health hazard, and how are packed snacks harmful?
Yeah, repeated use of cooking oil is again something which leads to degradation of the contents of the oil, and you then have trans fats which get created. Also, there is the problem of losing all the nutritive value. So it is best not to reuse cooking oil beyond a point. Unfortunately, when you talk about commercial practices, that doesn't happen and it gets used and reused many times. I've already discussed about how packed snacks are harmful because of the fact that they are ultra processed, plus the packaging which comes in plastics, which introduces microplastics into our food chain. And these things later on will lead to definite changes in the gut microbiota, leading to all the disease processes which I've already enumerated.
Next, another question from Dr. Benjamin. Is protein powder like commonly used Horlicks Boost, are they also classified as ultra-processed food?
These are basically processed foods rather than ultra processed foods. And the difference between them is that when you talk about protein powder, it depends on what sort of protein powder you're talking about. If you're talking about, say, whey isolates and all, they are definitely part of processed foods and they can be used in small quantities. But when we talk about the sort of muscle building ultra processed foods like creatine and those sort of powders, then definitely they are part of the ultra processed foods, because these are again flash fried and desiccated so that they don't spoil, and these are being used by bodybuilders and all. And that is the reason why you see many of these bodybuilders suffering from colorectal cancers and IBD.
Next question from Dr. Agarwal. How do you differentiate UC and CD? What are the confirmatory tests for each? And also, I feel that both UC and CD constitute IBD.
So this is not part of our discussion today, but just to give you a brief idea, IBD basically is a disease constellation where you have an autoimmune process which leads to ulceration in the large bowel. When it comes to ulcerative colitis, it is usually restricted to the large bowel. When it comes to Crohn's disease, it can also involve the whole GI tract, including the small bowel, the large bowel, as well as the oral cavity. Confirmatory tests for these would be colonoscopy with a biopsy for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. There are certain biomarkers also which can be used, like ESCA and fecal calprotectin and all. How to distinguish it from IBS is that IBS is a functional disease where you will not find any ulcers in the GI tract. You will probably have dysmotility, dysbiosis. There will be no GI bleeding, and IBS is basically easily diagnosed as a clinical entity, whereas for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, the hallmark is to get a biopsy from the ulcers and have a confirmatory diagnosis.
So we had a few similar questions on which oil can be considered best for cooking.
Well, the best cooking oil depends on cultural and social mores of whichever segment or geographical locality we are talking about. But if, as a simple answer, if you want, I would say extra virgin olive oil is probably the healthiest and the best for cooking. It is definitely one of the better oils to go for.
So Dr. Madhav asks, what happens to small chain fatty acids processing?
With processing, the small chain fatty acids tend to degrade and decrease in number. This also promotes changes in the microbiota, because diversity of the gut depends on SCFA generation. And with processing of the food, the SCFA levels keep going down and down. The diversity keeps going down. And finally, it can also lead to changes in the gene transcription process.
Next from Dr. Thakur, for those avoiding UPF and thriving on veg, cereals, and fruits, how about the poison contents on them also with genetically engineered food items?
Yeah, definitely, Dr. Thakur. Even if you avoid ultra processed food and if you're taking vegetable cereals and fruits, there is the ongoing risk of genetically modified food. India, fortunately, is still not completely awash with genetically modified food. But if you travel to the European Union, the western part of Europe specifically, and the US, Canada, and all, you will find a lot of genetically modified corn, wheat, rice, and so on and so forth. So definitely this can lead to all the problems which we have discussed. But genetically modified food, at least in these countries, is separately labeled, and it is a choice consumers can make whether they want to eat that food or to avoid that food.
So we have a few questions on olive oil. So one question is, can olive oil be heated and used? And another question on olive oil is olive oil versus virgin olive oil versus extra virgin olive oil. So if any insights on that, sir?
Yeah, see, basically, when we talk about this virgin and extra virgin and ultra virgin, these are basically marketing gimmicks. End of the day, the first extract which you get by pressing the olives is what is known as the ultra virgin olive oil. Now, whatever is the extracted part, after that, there is a remnant of the olive which can still undergo a lot of pressing and that will give you the so-called virgin olive oil. And finally, you have the slightly processed olive oil, which is what gets marketed most of the times. Except for the Mediterranean countries where olives are growing freely, like say in countries like Israel, uh, places in the Mediterranean, Egypt, and the Italian coast and all. Olive oil usually tends to be a little more expensive than your usual. But the ultra virgin olive oil is the first press olive oil which you get, which is supposed to be the absolutely the healthiest. And that definitely carries a higher premium in terms of pricing.
Next, Nandita is asking, sir, is it advisable to have raw beetroot as it is rich in oxalate? Also, please enlighten on what food to eat in raw in safe limit.
Well, Dr. Nandita, there is nothing like a safe limit. I think you have to eat based on what your stomach tells you. Your stomach will give you a satiety signal. So it is best that you do not consume raw food at nights, because most of the raw foods tend to produce a lot of gas. If you are taking cruciferous fruits and you are taking salads and all at night, if you suffer from IBS and constipation, it can actually make things much worse. Coming to raw beetroots, well, you can take it if you think that you are anemic and you want your diet to increase your hemoglobin. It is something you could try. The problem with beetroots and all is it tends to stain your stool, and many times it becomes very difficult to know whether the patient is having occult blood which is positive, or whether it is because of beetroots. But it is quite safe to have beetroots, provided when you say raw, that you've actually cleaned them well and you consume them when they are fresh.
Uh, so Dr. Bharadwaj asks, is pasteurized milk healthy or not? And also, does extreme heat destroy its nutritive value?
A great question, Dr. Bhardwaj. No clear answer for this. Basically, pasteurization has been a boon in terms of preventing milk from going bad. It has given food security to a lot of marginalized, economically poor, uh, societal subsets. However, pasteurized milk obviously is something which is a processed food. So it does lack certain nutrients which fresh milk does. But the problem with fresh milk also is that many of these cattle which give us milk are actually feeding on grass and cattle feed, which is also coming through ultra processed foods. So it is actually part of that milk which they are giving us. So it does have a problem with its nutritive value. However, not taking pasteurized milk in an Indian context where bovine mycobacteria is also a problem would be very risky. Extreme heat definitely destroys the nutritive value, but it increases the shelf life and is used for basically value addition to milk, which is most of the milk cooperatives do use extreme heat to preserve this, make milk powder and then sell it. So yes, not very healthy, but it helps in a tropical country like ours in preventing milk from going bad.
So there are some questions about the use of millets in our regular food. So addressing it together. Also, if millets are considered consumed in the form of cereal, which can be considered best?
Sorry, what was the question? Role of millets.
Role of millets in regular food, or if it's consumed in the form of cereal, which can be considered best.
Millets are actually superfoods, and they are basically very India specific foods which have now become very glamorous because a lot of film stars have started talking about millets, and a few celebrity dietitians have written books on millets. I'm very happy about this trend because millets are basically good. But please keep in mind that when you talk about millets, don't forget that they also have a high glycemic index. Not all millets bring down your sugar. If you're taking ragi and all, that will definitely increase your glycemic index. So please be aware of the glycemic index of the millets you're taking. Millets are good in the sense that they are basically quite well adapted to the Indian diet. And if we have millets earlier were considered the poor man's food, but have now become fashionable. So you have them being served in five-star hotels also. And I'm all for that trend. It's a great trend. Now, coming to Dr. Narendra Patel's question, what is better, white bread or brown? Which cereal you consider best? Well, any sort of bread is finally processed food. So end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you're taking. But between white and brown, I would choose the brown because it is less deleterious. Cereal which I consider best between bajra, jawar, and wheat, my choice would be for bajra and jawar. Wheat definitely because it is genetically modified and is known to cause truncal obesity in an Indian context. So we should, as far as possible, if we can shift to bajra and jawar, it is far healthier.
Next, Dr. Amarnath is asking the advantage of unpolished cereals to polished ones.
Well, unpolished cereals, Dr. Amarnath, are basically NOVA classification, one type of uh, foods. So they are definitely healthier than the polished ones, which are the processed ones. These are polished ones are not ultra processed; they are just processed food. Like I told you, these are category 2 or 3 instead of the 4, which is the ultra processed food. Now, coming to what are the advantages? The advantages are unpolished cereals are definitely healthier. The problem is the palatability and the taste, which definitely is not as good as the polished ones. So, if you can do the trade off between diminished taste but healthier food, then please go for the unpolished cereals. They are definitely better.
Uh, so Dr. Mohiddin wants to know how about stevia sugar that is extracted from plants?
Well, again, stevia or any sugar extract from any place, end of the day, has a high glycemic index. Stevia has been almost been touted as an alternative to artificial sweeteners, but the truth is that it is as deleterious as those. So it carries the same risks of sugar use which exists with the others. So just because it is extracted from the plants, do not forget that it has a very high glycemic index.
Next, Dr. Purohit says, thank you for the very relevant lecture. Besides UPF, chemicals used for early ripening of fruits and excess insecticides are used for vegetable and other crops are also carcinogenic. Also, which oil to be used, refined or kachigani, which is physically refined?
Well, if you can tolerate the taste of the kachigani, it is definitely much better. And I do agree with you that in UPF, the chemicals, this is mango season. I'm sure all of us are enjoying mangoes. So we in Gujarat had a cyclone uh, which led to unseasonal rain about 20 days back, and a lot of mango orchards obviously sustained a lot of losses. So now in Ahmedabad, where I'm based, we see a lot of mangoes on the roadside, which are obviously been ripened by carbide use, and you can actually make out that these are artificially ripened because the sort of fruit which is appearing in May is not something we see till late June. So the thing is, if you see unseasonal food, please keep in mind that this has been processed or has been artificially ripened. So we need to eat what is locally available and is in season. I think that's a very safe advice to give to your patients. Between refined and kachigani oil, like I said, definitely better to use kachigani compared to the refined. But there again, one needs to be careful about the taste trade-off with the health, because many times if it is not tasty, people then sort of binge on very very unhealthy food. And the problem with UPF is it's highly addictive. So snacking and irregular snacking times is very very common with this. So one needs to be very very aware of that, and therefore your food choices need to be palatable first, and then definitely the health aspect has to be taken into care.
So, a lot of questions on oil again. So, on a similar note, Dr. Agrawal is asking, should one use refined oils by rotation? Also, what about cold pressed refined oils?
Well, this is something which has been recommended by a lot of basic scientists. I personally have no problem if my patients want to rotate. Technically, it is good for the microbiota and the diversity so that the body keeps getting used to different intakes. Cold pressed refined oils, the jury is still out on them. They are available in the market. A lot of us have used them. We really do not have too much data regarding their safety or otherwise. However, if you can get the physically refined oil rather than the cold pressed one, it is definitely better to go for that.
So, Dr. Benjamin says, so is diabetic protein powder, they are also using artificial sweeteners. So, is it good for diabetic patients or is it better to avoid?
Great question, Dr. Benjamin. Again, yes, they are using an artificial sweetener, but the problem with that powder is that if you want to take protein powder without any sort of sweetener, it is very difficult for patients, even diabetics. So, yes, it's not great from the glycemic index point of view, but you have to see the trade off. Most of these are sarcopenic patients. So, if they are sarcopenic and you want to build muscle mass and they are not able to take it in a dietary form, it is something like 2 or 3 teaspoonfuls a day is not really going to increase the sugar too much. And I would not want them to avoid it if they are definitely hyperproteinemic, because having more protein and muscle mass is also equally important to maintain your uh, glycemia control.
So taking the last question, Dr. Swami, Sir says that I feel like no food is before. Is there any FSI or FDA taken initiative to rule out the adverse effects of processed food or any national action plan?
That's a great question, I must say, Dr. Manoj, and thanks for bringing that out. You are absolutely right. I completely agree with you that today we when I did research this topic, I was actually very scared, because having researched this, I have put about 30 odd slides for you, but I actually prepared more than 100 slides. And like I said, Barsha, I took the liberty of saying that this would be part one of a series, where first I have talked to you about ultra processed foods. Next, I'll be talking to you about microplastics. And lastly, I'll talk to you about the global epidemic of obesity, what I call as globesity. Now, all this is interlinked. This is also because no food is safe like before. We are never sure even when we buy what is known as organic food, that pesticides have not been used. We are never sure that they are not containing carcinogens. We are never sure because the quality of the soil has been degraded so badly. The quality of water has been degraded so badly. So our land, which is extremely fertile, and we are all fortunate to be born in this country of ours. However, our land, our air, our soil has been degraded to such an extent that obviously your food is going to carry this forward. We all know why vultures died out in India. That was because the vultures, when they ate the carcasses of the animals, the cattle which had died, they had been treated with diclofenac. Now, this diclofenac entered the system of the vultures and the vultures died out. So, our natural scavengers went out. So, it is something similar. We are now taking food which slowly, invisibly introduces the enemy into our system. And over a period of time, it leads to irreversible changes. Now, coming to what you said, very important thing, that the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, FSSAI and FDA, should take the initiative. I couldn't agree with you more. There are baby steps being taken by the government to regulate this. However, we still have a long way to go before we have any sort of actionable national action plan. As of today, it is basically something where the buyer has to be beware of what he's buying. Please try to avoid the processed foods. Simply put, don't buy anything which comes in a plastic pouch. Try to have fresh food. Try as far as possible to ensure that you take seasonal food, local food which is available. Try to go with uh, less fatty food, and have a good exercise program, because all these things are finally going to cause a huge epidemic for which we are completely unprepared, or I would say we just cannot prepare ourselves for the numbers we are going to be dealing with.
Thank you so much, sir. I think with that, we covered all the questions from our audience. And I would like to thank you once again for very patiently taking in the doubts coming in from our doctors. Thank you for this wonderful session. Always a great time learning from you. And really hope to see you again on Medflix. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Sure. Thank you, Basha. Bye. Good
Thank
night.
you, sir. Good night, sir.